talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Who knows what we're talking about tonight? Who knows where we are in the Sermon on the Mount? Fasting. That's what I'm talking about. So before we jump into fasting and talking about what Jesus has to say and what the Bible has to say about fasting, I want to be super clear with one thing up front, right? There's a lot of religions in the world, including those who may claim a certain, denomination of Christianity, may look at fasting as a way to get to God, as a requirement to be in the religion, right? To be a part of it. In order to be saved, you have to participate in this. And it's a very legalistic view. And so I want to start up front as we talk about fasting and what it is, that's not what we're talking about, right? That fasting is not a prerequisite to come to Jesus. That all you have to do to come to Jesus is to believe his gospel, right? All he requires is a broken and contrite heart and to confess with our mouths and believe in our heart that he is Lord and that God raised him from the dead. And then we're saved. Fasting falls into this other category of tools that Jesus gives us to get to know him better, right? Similar to prayer and reading our Bibles. Fasting falls in that category of what we call spiritual disciplines. And so these are things, once we've accepted the gospel, once we've come to know Jesus, we've tasted and seen that he is good, we start to want to desire more of what he desires for our life. We start to want to get to know him more and grow in relationship with him, and that's where he gives us these tools of prayer, worship, study, and fasting. And so as you hear more about and I teach what fasting is, please don't think like, man, I do not have it all together. I've never done that before. I don't know what that is. This Jesus thing isn't for me. Jesus just wants you to come to him. He just wants your heart, and he'll lead you in what's next and how he wants you to grow in relationship with him. So I'm going to pray, then we're going to open up the word, and we're going to go to the Sermon on the Mount, and then we'll talk a little bit about fasting, okay? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time, God. We thank you for this group of young adults and peers and leaders who have chosen to set aside their Tuesday night and to say the most important thing is to just come and study and be in community and worship you, Lord. And God, I just confess there's nothing good in and of myself to teach tonight, God, and that only you are the one who has the words of life, God. So I pray that your spirit in me would speak those words and that we would just glorify you in all things tonight. Amen. So we're going to look at Matthew 6, verses 16 to 18, okay? I'll give you guys just a second to get there. What's going on? How's it going? Tommy and Tommy, what's up? Could be a band, Tommy and Tommy. Good to see you guys. Cool. So Matthew 6, 16 to 18. Jesus says, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show others they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that it will not be obvious to others that you are fasting. But only your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Did anybody pick up on a phrase that Jesus uses twice just within these 3 verses? If you did, you can say it. When you fast, right? And so he doesn't say if you fast, he says when you fast. And so Jesus assumes that his disciples are going to participate in this thing called fasting, right? He assumes that they're going to be doing this, and so he's just teaching them how to do it. And so last week, as Phil was up here teaching on prayer, I felt led to volunteer on this because this is something that in my own personal walk with Christ, God's been leading me in. When I see that Jesus assumes his followers will fast, I really, up until recently, hadn't even been prompted to do that in my prayer walk. And it hasn't been until recent months that the Lord said, like, why have you not taken this spiritual discipline up to follow me? And so even out of personal conviction, I felt led to take on this message. And then I also look at our Western culture, right? We're a culture of consumers where it's all about what do we need, how are we going to get it as fast as we possibly can, and how does it make us feel, right? Like I think of the wordplay, right, of food fast, what we're talking about, and fast food, right? A food fast, denying self, putting aside our needs, deciding not to feed our stomach but to feed the spirit, versus fast food, which is I'm hungry, I want it now, and give it to me through this little window into my 97 Subaru Impreza, because I'm going to eat it on my way to the next place I'm going. Right? It's such it's so lost in our culture. And so I felt called when Jesus teaches about fasting, I didn't want to just stay just in these 8 verses about how it looks when we fast, but I want to talk about what it is, why we do it, and how we do it. So before I jump into the why, the what, why, and how, let's just look at what Jesus says and break down some of the text a little bit more. So the first thing Jesus has to say about fasting is the same thing that Phil taught on about prayer last week, is that when you fast, don't do it to be seen by others. He says that the people who fast and who pray out loud and do it to get attention, they've received their reward already. And I was talking to Briar beforehand. I was telling him that's a really scary verse to me, because it says that those who fast in quiet and do it in secret, their reward's going to be God, right? And so for your reward in full to be the attaboys of this world, to be the good job, you're so great, you're so holy of this world, that is a really, really poor reward, and that's not one that's really worth it, in my opinion. And so I find that to be really scary. Jesus even talked about these people, right, who do religious things outwardly just to be seen, but they're not honoring God, right? He called them whitewashed tombs. Jesus says, these are whitewashed tombs which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside they appear as righteous, but on the inside they are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. God's not interested in you doing things to be rewarded. He's interested, he wants you to do things out of a pure heart, the same way Phil talked about prayer last week. It's all about the heart behind it. Another thing I thought was interesting is what Jesus says is not to make it obvious that you are fasting by looking like you're in discomfort. And so I wonder if it's obvious if you're in discomfort that you're fasting, could discomfort potentially be a part of fasting? And we'll talk about that now. I'm going to jump into what exactly is fasting. And so to put it plain and simple, a basic definition is fasting is abstaining from something. It's typically, has to do with food, but there's other things you can fast from. You could fast from your phone. You could fast from television. You could fast from video games, energy drinks, shopping. There's a number of things that you can fast from. But what's important when we fast is that it's a legitimate sacrifice, right? It's not just something like I hate mayonnaise. And so for me to say, I'm going to fast from mayonnaise. I'm not going to put mayonnaise on a single sandwich this week, and I'm going to do it unto the Lord. That's not legitimate. That's not denying myself. That's me saying what I already plan on doing for myself, I'm just not going to do, and I'm going to say it's for the Lord, right? But we also have to weigh out that fasting isn't punishment. It's not punishing ourselves. There are some religions in the world, like I said, with legalism that may take a form of punishment and say they're righteous because they're punishing themselves. That's not biblical either, and that's important to kind of set aside. Some people, like myself, if you came up through Catholicism at all, you might be aware of like a seasonal fast called Lent, right? That it's like 40 days before Easter, and so that's a time where people might abstain or fast from like a specific thing or a habit or even a pleasure. So like an example, when I was growing up, I chose to fast from soda as a teenager. I drank it all the time, and that was a legitimate sacrifice that I felt was like, this is something that I need to just give to the Lord for 40 days. So that brings me to my first point, right, about what is fasting. So fasting is giving up this thing because we're choosing to rely on God as our sustainer rather than the things he uses to sustain us. And so think about it like this, right? We have the things that God uses to sustain us: food, water, shelter, clothing. And then we have the sustainer. If we didn't have the sustainer, we wouldn't have those things. But without those things, we still have the sustainer, right? And so fasting puts it in perspective that even without these things that are over here that he uses to sustain us, God can carry us on his own, that we don't need them. And so we choose to rely on him. An example of this was in John chapter 4, Jesus, with the woman at the well, his disciples meet back up with him after they were in town, and they come to Jesus and they tell him, you should eat lunch, Jesus. And he says, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. My food, said Jesus, is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. So really, fasting from food is really feasting on the Word of God, right? And feasting on His will. When we abstain from these things, we're digging deeper into who God is, choosing to worship Him and choosing to do His will. And so the next question is, if this is what fasting is, why do we do it? So you may have heard of like intermittent fasting, right? Or some diets that are called fasts. There are definitely physical benefits to fasting, but that's not why we do it. If we choose to take up fasting for that reason, that's exactly what you're doing. You're dieting. You're not worshiping the Lord. And there's also, legalistic versions, like I said, where people will fast to punish themselves. And once again, that's not biblical either. But there's some really cool reasons that God chooses to use fasting in our lives. And one of them is that it reveals strongholds. And so, like an example from my personal story this past week, I felt called by God Thursday night to fast on Friday, from sunrise to sundown, just a water fast. I was off of work Friday, and I had to take my car to Stewartstown to get worked on. And right across the street from the mechanic is Saubles. And your boy loves some Saubles donuts. Oh, yeah. The chocolate-covered sour cream Saubles donut is great. I woke up Friday morning, right, and just rolled over out of bed to turn off my alarm clock, and I was like, I'm going to get a donut for breakfast. I was so excited until I wiped the sleep away from my eyes and remembered, the Lord, told me you should fast in preparation for your sermon. And can I tell you that it was a legitimate struggle, not just to diet or to have the willpower not to get a donut, but to literally choose to obey God's call to fast or to want to eat a donut. Like, what kind of stronghold is that on my life that I'm struggling to obey God over sweets, right? The other reason we fast and the way God uses it is to reveal deep emotional, relational, and spiritual things that we might cover up with food or things. And so another example from this weekend, Saturday, the day after I fasted, right? My wife and I had a great conversation, but it was deep, it was emotional. And it was right after dinner. Yet immediately after this conversation, after I'd already eaten dinner, my first inclination was, I'm hungry. I'm going to go get some food. And what was I doing? I was choosing to fill this void, right, of these emotions I was feeling with food. I was trying to cover it up. And I wouldn't have known that had I not fasted the day prior. Does that make sense? I like what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12. He says, all things are lawful for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And so here you can see us being mastered by food here, right? And this is in ways that may seem innocent. A donut, getting a snack after dinner. But the reality is anything that you can't live without aside from Jesus is an idol, right? And so I was giving food preference over bringing my feelings to Jesus and being obedient to Him. And I wouldn't have realized it had I not chosen to fast, or had God not called me to fast, I should say. So some other reasons we might fast, right? There's examples in the Bible, if we go back to the Old Testament, of God calling people to fast to intercede for people. And so an example of a corporate fast where God called an entire people to fast together was in the days of Queen Esther. So that the whole Jewish people fasted to intercede for her. She would go before King Xerxes. And then another example of fasting on an individual level in the Bible was Daniel. When he was exiled into Babylon, him, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, all his homeboys who were serving King Nebuchadnezzar were being fed the king's food. But what did Daniel say? He didn't want to defile himself with the food of the Babylonians. And so he said, bring me vegetables. And he fasted on just vegetables and water. And that was his way of honoring the Lord, so as not to defile himself with the things of the world. So my next point as to why we fast, how can we sum it up? We fast as a discipline we can use to worship and grow in relationship with God by removing the distractions of the world. And so that leaves, how do we fast? We've already talked some about it, right? Abstaining from food or something else. But what's really important and what sets biblical fasting apart from dieting or, legalistic fasting is that we have to intentionally incorporate prayer and worship. If it's not for the Lord, then that's all it is a diet. The other thing that's important in how we fast is we take the time that we would spend doing that thing we're fasting from, and we commit it to the Lord. And so if you're fasting from food, right, meal times. Like I know a man in my life who, on occasion, he'll fast from lunch. And so rather than gratifying his own hunger, he takes that time just to seek the Lord. And it's nothing crazy, right? We said fasting isn't legalism. It doesn't have to fit into this box for Jesus to accept it. He looks at the heart. And so just fasting from a meal could do something radical in your life and in your prayer life where you choose to believe that God is your sustainer and not that meal, right? The other thing we do is we take that discomfort, right? We talked about how being uncomfortable may be a part of fasting, right? Because we're choosing to abstain from a meal. And we choose to direct that towards God. A passage from a book that I was reading in preparation for this called The Celebration of Disciplines, right? And it records, not the whole book, but this passage recorded a few notes a guy took who had incorporated fasting regularly for 2 years and kind of his progression and mindset. And one of his notes says, he reflected more on Christ's suffering and the suffering of those who are hungry and have hungry babies. And so he was taking that discomfort that he felt, right? And he was able to sympathize with Jesus. Paul says that he wanted to be like Jesus in his suffering. And this is one way we can do it, just in the quietness of our hearts, in the privacy of our rooms, right? We can relate to Jesus and know some of the suffering that he felt, just a portion of it. The best way I can kind of describe what fasting is from this same book, right? Or how we fast is from this same book. It says, the most important thing to monitor is the inner attitude of your heart. Outwardly, you will be performing the regular duties of your day, but inwardly, you will be in prayer and adoration, song and worship. In a new way, cause every task of the day to be a sacred ministry to the Lord. How everyday mundane duties however mundane your duties, for you they are a sacrament. Cultivate a gentle receptiveness to divine breathings, right? And so that's my next important thing, and probably the most important thing you could take from this message, right, is that fasting, when we fast, we make the everyday mundane sacred to God. We take our normal routine and we choose to just dig in a little bit deeper and do everything we do unto him, right? And the last part of how do we fast is exactly what Jesus is saying. We don't do it for the attention. We don't do it for the attaboys or for the sympathy or for people to see us, but we do it to honor God. Right? When we tell people we're fasting, I'm trying to think of how to say this well, right? When we fast, it doesn't have to be a secret, but we also don't want to tell those who don't have to know, because we may be tempted to convince ourselves that we're holier than we are, or try and convince those people that we're holier than we are, right? But that's not to say you can't share with a mentor. In fact, I would argue that talking with a mentor, someone discipling you and telling them you're feeling led to fast could be a very beautiful thing, and they may fast with you. And there's power in that. And you may fast corporately, and there's power in that. And so I don't want to say don't tell anyone you fast, because I think that is legalism as well. But be careful who you share it with, because in your heart you may be tempted, once again, to make yourself think you're better than you are, or try and convince that person you're better than you are. And lastly, I have just a few logistical notes on fasting, right? It's kind of something, it's physical, it involves our body, and so it's important to know, first of all, it's something you want to work your way into. And like I said, fasting from one meal could just be the first step towards building that spiritual discipline. What I did, fasting from sunup to sundown and then breaking that fast with dinner. Don't try to fit fasting in a box and think, once again, in a legalistic way, I have to do it for this many hours or this many days, or it's not considered fasting. Like, the Lord honors your heart and what you're giving to him. For food fast, specifically, working your way into that as well, there's water-only fast, but there's also juice fasts, or an example of the Daniel fast where you can do fruits and vegetables. And like I said before, fasting doesn't have to look the same every time. I think of someone who shared with me as I was talking about this sermon is they were doing the Daniel fast for 40 days, but they knew they had a communal meal coming up. And so part of them not feeling like this was a legalistic thing and like the fast wasn't ruling them and they were doing it for the Lord was that they could participate in this communal meal and know that the fast wasn't there to serve, that they weren't there to serve the fast was there to serve them in their spiritual walk, right? And so don't make it something legalistic. Don't make it something that has to look the same, or it doesn't have to look the same every time. And lastly, just note, obviously, if you have a medical condition or necessities, like that's something, consult your doctor, or once again, don't feel like it's not a real fast because you have to take, food with your medication. Like, that is just as much, the Lord honors that, and that's part of your heart too. And I feel like that was just important to throw out there. And then last is kind of a challenge. And you guys can thank Phil for this, because this was his idea. We have a unique opportunity coming up next Tuesday, right, as Grove's Giving. And so it's going to be an amazing meal that we're going to have here just as a family and eating together. But I would challenge you to consider and pray about fasting next Tuesday, right? And maybe consider whether it be a meal or a sunrise to sundown fast. Like, I think about the example I got that from were a lot of the Old Testament minor fasts were from sunrise to sunset. And in Judges 20, we see an example of the Israelite army, right? They're seeking the Lord, inquiring of him, and they fast from sunrise to sunset. And so I just can, like I said, it is not a command. It's not required to follow Jesus, but it's something he may use in your spiritual walk. So I would consider praying about if Jesus would be calling you to fast together next Tuesday. And that was going to be awesome as we can come together and celebrate and break the fast as a family as we feast during Grove's Giving, right? And so I think this may be a cool opportunity for us to grow together and to just maybe have some cool stories about how the Lord worked through fasting as we do it together and pray for each other, pray for our own spiritual growth. It'll be really exciting, I think. And so with that, I'm going to give you our questions, and we'll break out into table time. And so question number 1, is there anything that may be mastering you, even if it's innocent or seemingly harmless? What could God be calling you to fast from other than food? And what are some barriers preventing you from fasting from that thing? And what would help overcome those barriers? So I am going to turn you guys over to table time, and thank you very much for letting me teach this evening.